why are you reading the news? Like, what is your purpose with consuming the news at all? Because there's this feeling that it's just good to be informed, and we just need to be informed for the sake of being informed. And it's like, it is, I run a news org. Obviously, I believe in the value of remaining informed, but let's go a step further.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This show's available wherever you get your podcasts, and it is the show in which I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence to show how our worldview based on the truth changes everything. Would you consider sharing the podcast with a friend or a family member if you enjoy the conversation? My guest today is Jason Woodruff. Jason and his team are committed to sharing local and world news with accuracy, fairness, and integrity. We're going to have an amazing conversation about how much news consumption is too much, how much is too little, and how to consume whatever we consume as believers. Please welcome Jason to the show. Jason Woodruff, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor.
Well, it's fun to see what God's doing through you with the pour over. You've got how many subscribers now?
Little over 500,000.
500,000 subscribers who are getting 3 times a week news with a biblical focus. I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about that, because we're in the political season, so to speak, and there's a lot of tension that is rising, and a lot of believers don't know what to do or how to process it. So I think we're going to have some great insights. But just tell us a little bit about how you approach it.
Yeah, so the pour over I started what is now the pour over in 2018, and it was really born out of a personal exercise and desire to say, hey, it feels like my relationship with the news is not healthy, and I'm consuming a lot of news. I can see how my news, I spent some time like only consuming liberal media and then only consuming conservative media to just kind of like see how they do things differently. And what frustrated me most was, even as I kind of did that exercise, I would watch my viewpoints shift towards what I was consuming more of. And it's like, I know going in what they're trying to do, and I still like feel myself shifting. And I really just want to be a Christian first. You know, I don't want to be a Republican or a Democrat first. I want to be a Christian who is also engaged and aware, but put Christ first. And so the way we do it now is, it's like you said, 3 times a week, summarize the biggest, most visible news of the day, the things that friends and coworkers who are possibly not Christian will be talking about. And then we summarize that in a politically neutral way, and then pair it with brief foundational biblical reminders. They pull from one of 4 categories: keeping an eternal perspective, remaining humble, loving everyone, including enemies, and taking action and responding. It's very, very light on theology. We don't weigh in on like the correct theological opinion on things. We just say, here's what happened, and here is a reminder to keep Christ front of mind. And there are other great people like you who will down the road weigh in and offer kind of more thoughtful theological reflections on things. That's not what we do. We're quick. It's timely news, but also paired with Christ.
Say those 4 things again, Jason. I think this is hugely important, because this is the lens through which, from a biblical worldview, you view everything. Even if you are in a position where you have to make decisions, one side or another. But what are those 4 things again?
So the 4 things are keeping an eternal perspective. Okay. And the big thing there is, hey, a lot of this just doesn't matter. You know, like we're promised that we will be alive in 10,000 years in heaven. So process news based on that. And if it doesn't matter in 10,000 years, then don't let it take up too much headspace. Remaining humble and open to correction, loving enemies and neighbors. But a lot of the news is trying to get you to dislike someone, you know, or painting someone out as bad. And there also just are a lot of bad people in the news. And it's like, hey, we're called to love them. And then taking action, saying, hey, we can't just consume and complain. There are times when we need to step up, especially when the Holy Spirit stirs you towards an issue. It's like, hey, go do something. Faith is, James specifically has a lot to say about people that hear and never do. And so we want to challenge our readers to do and respond and care.
Yeah. Jason, as you pursue that, we've done a number of shows in the last couple of years on social media, how social media actually monetizes anger and wants people to be divided, because divided people get mad, and mad people go onto social media pages and they read and they write, and they're being served up advertisements the entire time.
Right.
But your focus, you said that you write the stories in a politically neutral way. I think there are probably some people who are watching or listening right now saying, I don't know about that. I don't know how you would even do that. What is politically neutral? So how do you go about trying to identify what that is?
Yeah. So our goal, and we have writers on the team who are liberal and conservative, and their job, and they review every story, and their job is to say, hey, when I read this, I feel like my political views are not being misrepresented. And so that's really our kind of test of being politically neutral, and not saying that we get it right all the time, but and part of our goal is to say, hey, if whether or not you're conservative or liberal or vote for a Democrat or a Republican, you should today, your enemy is likely a political enemy. We're called to love our enemies. It's hard to think of someone, like, it's hard for me to think of an enemy in my life except for someone who disagrees with me politically. That would be the closest thing I have.
Right. Good point.
And so to say, let's help me. I should desire to understand what they're trying to say, and or thinking, so that I can love them, so that I can engage in this conversation. And so we strive to be politically neutral, not because we think that being politically center or neutral on every topic is the correct Christian stance. It's often not, but to say, as a news source, and that's the lane that we're in, there is value in being politically neutral and helping people understand, true or false, what is the other side hearing? Like, what is there's this debate going on, or there's a bill that doesn't pass in Congress or whatever. And it's like, half the country's hearing one thing, half the country's hearing another. What are the arguments on both sides? And it's, the whole newsletter takes 5 minutes to read, and the longest stories we write are 140 words. So we're by no means giving a comprehensive overview of these topics. We're saying, this is what's in the news, this is what head 1 is saying, this is what head 2 is saying, end story, and then, hey, here's a reminder that you're called to love your enemies, and that's basically how we would handle a divisive topic or something like that.
Yeah.
The facts. Hopefully you understand both sides, and then you feel a little bit of conviction of saying, like, oh yeah, man, I totally thought one side was right. And there's that reminder that I need to love people who believe the other side still.
Yeah. That's helpful. So it's not neutral as in neutered from a viewpoint. It's neutral as in, here's what people on one side say, here's people on the other side and what they say, and in their words, rather than, here's what I'm going to tell you that they believe so that I can put them in the worst possible light so that you'll believe me.
Right. Yes. But we strive to be politically balanced, help people grow empathy and understanding for the other side without trying to persuade them one way or another. Because, and a lot of the reason we stepped into this spot is because there are so many, it feels like people aren't doing this, and there are so many great organizations that are offering thoughtful reflections on hard topics and writing longer form articles and doing longer form podcasts, and that's not what our strength is. We want to be quicker, timelier, and say, hey, by the time the Dr. Jeff episode drops, you haven't already you've heard about it from the pour over and been challenged to keep Christ front of mind. You haven't heard about it 7 times from CNN or 7 times from Fox and like had only one viewpoint reinforced over and over. So that's the kind of very narrow lane that we're trying to stay in. Of we want you to be informed and really just have a healthy relationship with the news, in that you are informed but not obsessed, and remaining focused on Christ and having your worldview be shaped by Christ, not a news outlet.
Yeah. Jason, tell us about a news story that you found especially compelling recently and how you approach that news story in the pour over.
So this is one of the points that we bring up in talking about how few things matter, and keeping an eternal perspective, because I'm involved in every newsletter. And we wrote about 8 stories on Monday, and we're writing about 8 stories tomorrow. Wow. And I couldn't tell you all 8 stories, and so it's like we get so fixated on these things, and they become so important, and then we move on to the next thing. But let me look through. Oh, the State of the Union. So we covered the State of the Union, or let's see what else. The economy, and so State of the Union. We introed what the State of the Union is. We assume very little, and then we talked about Biden's talking points, and then who the guest list for each side was, and how that highlighted specific issues. And so, broadly speaking, Biden talked about these things. The guest list was the approach that we took, highlighted that like abortion and IVF and the economy, these things are all top of mind, and there's some signaling going on there. And then a little bit about Senator Britt's rebuttal. And so again, trying to kind of provide equal weight. And if you didn't even know the State of the Union was happening, you now know it was happening, kind of know what was talked about, and there's a link to go watch the whole thing. But you're by no means an expert on the State of the Union, having just read our summary. But you can engage and not feel left out in a conversation the next day.
Right. That's really significant. So I don't know if workplaces actually have water coolers anymore, but the idea of being around the water cooler, chatting, and feeling like you've got something to say, something to contribute as a Christian, rather than just, wow, I got to set my faith aside in order to even hear or speak to what's being discussed.
And one of the things that we want to challenge people on is to think about, so the pour over summarizes the news, and it applies a number of principles that we've never really defined well, or advertised. And that's part of a new initiative with, we're launching what's called the News Health Checkup. And I've started writing a Sunday email that goes through one of kind of 8 principal categories and things, principles that are key to having a spiritually healthy relationship with the news. And one of the things that we're challenging people to think about is, okay, why are you reading the news? Like, what is your purpose with consuming the news at all? Because there's this feeling that it's just good to be informed, and we just need to be informed for the sake of being informed. And it's like, it is, I run a news org. Obviously, I believe in the value of remaining informed, but let's go a step further. And one of the things that I think is compelling is to say the news is what everyone talks about. The news is, if there's a water cooler in your office, that's what people are talking about. They're talking about the Oscars last night. They're talking about the State of the Union. They're talking about the economy. And so to say, hey, I'm informed and I'm thinking about this from a biblical foundation and a missional worldview, to say, how do I appear different and use this conversation to glorify God? How do I reflect that I'm less concerned, like more confident in my eternity? I'm feeling less anxious than you. I'm feeling less angry than you. I'm reflecting and overflowing with the fruit of the Spirit. it's the news. There's this assumption, and there is a fact that when you consume a lot of news, that generally makes you angry, anxious, harsh, rude. And it's like, those are the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. Like, the fruit of the Spirit is like evidence that God's Spirit is with you is gentleness, patience, peace, love. And so just getting this right and saying, I can consume the news and be influenced and overflowing with the Spirit is such an opportunity to share the gospel, have gospel conversations, look different, and show the joy and the value of knowing Christ, because it's not, we're covering the same news. It's not like we only share good news that makes you feel happy. Like, it's the same news that if you watch it or consume it elsewhere, you're going to be depressed and fearful and anxious. But it's amazing how a little bit of Jesus goes a long way, and saying like, hey, the war is still happening, the economy's still doing poorly, or whatever the news of the day is, there's still political strife, but we have hope in Christ. We have, like, you're good. You're called to love this person. How can this person, other people are feeling angry and anxious. How can you help them? It's shifting your viewpoint. One of the reasons you should be consuming the news is to have these conversations and to help people that are consuming all this fear with nothing to do. And it just produces anger and anxiousness. And that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the calmness that you're describing and the way Jesus taught his disciples, Luke chapter 12, don't strive for what you will eat or what you will drink. For the Gentile world eagerly seeks all these things, and your Father knows that you need them, but seek first his kingdom, and all these things will be provided for you. There's a calmness there. It's not a disengagement, but it's a perspective by which you engage that is really hard to keep in mind front and center when you're being pulled this way or that by the opinions being expressed.
And I think so. This has you have likely seen this more than I have, but it was not that long ago that being a news junkie meant you read 2 newspapers and watched the nightly news. Like that there was just a limited amount of news. So we don't have any generational wisdom on how to handle the situation that we're in, which is now you can spend 24 hours a day consuming news on 3 times speed and just not make any dent in the amount of journalism. Some is true journalism, some is not, right, produced in a day. It's like there's too much. So figuring out how to, like, what are appropriate news boundaries? Because if you are just consuming way too much, that means you're not acting on it. And again, like, to what end? Like, we need to, grandma didn't need boundaries with the news because she couldn't overconsume. And we can. And so we need to look and think about, okay, what are thoughtful biblical boundaries that allow us to be informed and be engaged, because we do live here. We're called to serve the world and minister to the world. We need to know what's going on. It would be a bad thing if Christians were not engaged at all and knew nothing about what was going on. But at the same time, more does not equal better. It's not like, if I spend more time in the news, if I'm more informed, then I'll be more like Christ. No, you become more like Christ and you build a Christian worldview by knowing Christ better, by spending more time with him. And then that overflows into everything in your life, including, almost by accident, whatever's happening in the world that day. And so it's a shift of saying, like, we need to think about why we're consuming the news, set boundaries, and acknowledge that we can't consume everything. It's not virtuous to just consume more and more. We need a purpose. We need to be thoughtful about this.
Yeah. You know, I'm smiling because I was thinking my neighbor across the street years and years ago when the internet was first a thing. And he had a little 2-car garage. It was just his like man cave. And I went in there and he just had these huge 3-ring binders full of papers. I said, what are those? He said, I'm printing out everything I can from the internet and organizing it in these binders. Like,
so when the internet goes away, I'll still have all the information, you know?
And it was funny, but I completely got it. Like, oh yeah, I understand. Like, so you in order to make sense of this, you have to feel like you've consumed all of it and organized it somehow in a system that's comfortable for you. But you don't understand what the internet actually is. You're
Yeah, that's I don't know if I've heard a better analogy of like, you know, trying to bail out the ocean or something, you know. It's like here you are trying to drain the ocean with a thimble. You're trying to print and catalog the internet.
Yeah. It was pretty funny. I told him I want to invest in whatever company produces the printer ink that you're using.
Yes.
But that's a human desire to feel like I comprehensively understand this. And you know, the way the internet works is you go down, you get to it, and then, you know, we even call it going down the rabbit hole. All of a sudden you're here and then here and then here and then here and then here. Then you look up and realize, wow, you know, 45 minutes has passed and my life is not any better than it was 45 minutes ago, except that I have 45 minutes less of life. Did you know that only 1% of 18 to 29-year-olds hold a biblical worldview? That means that 99 out of 100 young people you meet are held captive by counterfeit truth. But that's exactly where Summit Ministry steps in. We train over 65,000 students a year to form and to keep a biblical worldview for the rest of their lives. The transformations are remarkable, and they're lasting according to our 1-year, 5-year, and 10-year alumni surveys. But I need your help to reach more of these spiritually hungry students. Listen, for just $33, you can sponsor an hour of training for a student. And that hour can make the difference between spiritual life or death. So when you become a monthly partner, I'm going to send you stories of the students you've created opportunities for. And they're going to bless your life. And as a listener of the Dr. Jeff Show, I know you care about the rising generation. Will you help them through Summit? To donate, go to summit.org/equip. Summit.org/equip. And as a thank you, I'm going to share with you a curated collection of lectures, interviews, and videos so you can see for yourself the worldview shift that students are receiving. That's summit.org/equip.
We all know people who are overnewsed, like overinformed on things, and you can just look and be like, man, you would be better if you turned off the TV or the radio or something like that. Yeah. And so, but again, this is a relatively recent shift of that's a relatively new thing that someone can waste their day on these things. And it's not just wasting your time, although that is part of it. It's the news that holds your attention for that long is often politicized and pulling on emotions to keep you engaged and entertained, and consuming news about real people and real events that have real impact for entertainment is just a very spiritually damaging thing. And one of the things that ends up happening is you've not only lost 45 minutes of your day, but you've now formed opinions on things that you're not going to do anything about. And it often will then lead to an argument with a real person, and you're going to damage this relationship over something that you're not doing anything about, and like that you can't do anything about. And so it's like, okay, it's not just that you've wasted time, you've also harmed relationships and people. So it's like forming an opinion on something that doesn't impact you and that you can't impact, that then damages a relationship. You would be better off not knowing about that thing.
Yeah.
And and that's but it feels virtuous. And I wrote about this in my most recent Sunday newsletter. It's like my perspective used to be, and I don't know when it changed, that having a Christian worldview meant having a Christian or defensively Christian position on a lot of things. That like the more Christian your worldview was, the more things you had an opinion on that seemed Christian. And it's like, no, a Christian worldview is Christ that then happens to be applied to things that are relevant to you. But it's not virtuous to just go out and try to learn more and more so that you can form opinions on more and more things and say, well, I think Jesus would have thought this or that. It's like, hold off on forming an opinion or sharing an opinion. It's usually not required. And if it is, don't go to pundits to learn what you should think. Go to someone who knows Jesus better. Like, go to your pastor, go to someone that you can ask questions and talk about. Say like, I saw this headline. IVF is in the news. I've never really thought about IVF. Is that okay? Don't go to Fox or CNN to learn whether or not IVF is okay. Like, go to, like, do some thoughtful research that's not being fed to you, but that you're going out and searching and learn more about IVF, and then go talk with people that know and love Jesus. And again, if that's something that impacts you, but if IVF doesn't impact you, your time is probably better spent on something else that you can impact, on going and meeting your neighbor, loving your neighbor, caring for your kids, doing something like that. Because we can't, there's the problem with the amount of news is somewhat twofold. Or there's two categories. One, there's just a ton of news that doesn't matter. And it's easy to get sucked in, but it doesn't matter. The flip side is there's a ton of news that does matter, and you can't possibly engage on all the topics. Like and the news will just constantly hit you with another topic. There's a war in Israel. That is, people are dying. There are serious, like there's right and wrong. There are serious issues there. There's topics on abortion, there's homelessness, there's starvation. There's like, these are things that are important and we should have opinions on and we should move on, but we each individually cannot do all of the things. And so to continue to drink from the fire hose, you're having your attention pulled towards the Grammys, which like have its place, or the Oscars, which have its place, but should not consume that much of your life or attention. And then you also end up being flooded with guilt and indecision of like, well, here are 5 things that do matter, and I'm just learning more and more about all 5 and making no progress or difference on any of them. So you'd be better off, and this is our advice, is to say minimal news, 5 to 10 minutes a day of you being aware of what's happening so you can engage. And I'll say that is a lot less news than I as a newsie want to consume. But understanding what is happening, broad strokes in the world, so that you can engage in those conversations. And then the time that you would have spent going down the rabbit holes, go make progress on something that God has laid on your heart and that you're uniquely equipped to do. And that should be how those are healthy boundaries with the news, like broad strokes that will allow you to be informed and engaged, but not obsessed and not idolizing. And you will feel much less anxious, much less angry when you're actually doing something, because the guilt is removed. If I'm actually working thoughtfully on something and something else comes up, I can like say, hey, I'm going to take 5 minutes and pray, and maybe I'll go donate to people that are like need help and are focusing on this. And then I'm going to keep working on my thing, because my thing's still important. And I'm so glad there are other people working on that thing. I'm not going to feel guilty that I'm not working on that thing. Right. I'm aware of it. I'm doing what I can. But I don't have this anxious, directionless energy.
You don't have that internalized guilt about everything that's happening around you that you can't control. Well, last week I had breakfast with my city councilman, and he wanted to meet just because we're friends and because he wanted some insight on a biblical worldview of some of the things he was dealing with. He didn't ask any questions about national political issues. His questions were things like, what's a biblical worldview of policing? What's a biblical worldview of road construction? What, how do we represent a biblical worldview when we make zoning decisions? And I was a little unprepared for the conversation because I kind of thought, oh yeah, I know a lot about a biblical worldview of these national issues, but how do we handle zoning? Where should the power lines go? Should Colorado Springs Utilities be doing this or that? There's a new park we want to put in this neighborhood. Do the neighbors want it, or would they rather, that the city just sell it and build condos there? It's that kind of thing that we sometimes miss. What's really happening around us that is important, because those zoning decisions they make, Jason, aren't just going to go away in a year or two. Those affect the city for the next several decades.
Mm-hmm. It's again, this is not an original thought, but the news used to be local. It wasn't, again, a few hundred years ago, news traveled at the speed of horseback, know? So like you couldn't be aware of what was going on in another state in a timely manner, let alone across the world. Like there were real issues happening in Europe that you would just never hear about. Like you couldn't be concerned about them. And now local news can't compete with the intrigue of the most exciting or horrific thing happening anywhere on the planet in the last 5 minutes. And so, and again, it indicates that we are too often consuming news as entertainment to say, I want to know what is the biggest news, the most flashy news, what's happening to the most important people, instead of your neighbor, instead of you, like the zoning decision is just boring, but if it was the only news you could read, you'd be like, oh yeah. And I can actually see how this would impact me. And I'm going to form an opinion and I'm going to go talk with my city councilor and do this. Whereas now you have an opinion on, China and Taiwan. And it's like, you're probably over prepared for that conversation because Biden or Xi is not about to call you and ask for a biblical worldview on how we should handle Taiwan, even though you're more prepared for that conversation than you are zoning in your neighborhood. Yeah. And so it's just a bad thing that has happened, but it makes sense. And we have to intentionally, again, set boundaries and think and force ourselves to do these things and to care about the correct things, because others will not help you care about the correct things. They will help you care about the things that make you angriest and sell the most ads. And it's like, it's not bad to be aware of those things, but it is bad to dwell on those things that you can't impact and don't impact you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the balance that you're giving. I can see people who realize listening to the show, oh, I am an overconsumer. But then there are other people who, we're here in Manitou Springs, Colorado. If you go downtown and ask somebody what's going on in the news, they're like, don't talk to me about that. It, ruins my vibe. They're disengaged because they feel more centered if they're not bothered by the tension that they might experience thinking about things. So let me just read a couple poll results to you real quick and then kind of frame this question. Yeah. The Pew Foundation, which you know of, they do a lot of polling, and their polls are very good. They're really in depth. They did a poll about, what do you think about when you think about politics? Well, how does it make you feel? 65% of people said they feel exhausted. 55% said when they think about politics, they feel angry. 10% said they feel hopeful, and 4% said they feel excited. So it's pretty obvious that people are really disturbed by what they hear going on around them. And on the one hand, I think, okay, I don't want people to feel disturbed. But then I thought, well, maybe I do. Maybe there's a certain good level of feeling disturbed that I need to cultivate. Because in the real world, you don't resolve everything in a 30-minute time frame with 12 minutes of commercials. You know, or even in a 2-hour movie. In the real world, you don't solve a lot of things at all. You just manage them. Mm-hmm. And something about living in that tension can actually be good for us. Like we always treat it as negative, and it certainly can be, in the same way that if I'm training for a race, I know the difference between I'm exhausted because I just did a hard run and I'm actually injured, right? I know the difference between one. I feel pain in both of those situations. One of them is a good pain and one of them is a bad pain. And so I know the difference, but I'm just wondering, how do we help people manage that tension? Because when I read a poll like that, I'm like, yeah, people are tired of fighting. Or maybe it's just that people are conflict avoidant and they shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and first off, it's funny. My dad is a pastor, and he was telling me about a friend who, a new condition of apparently all this person's friendships is no one talked to them about what's in the news. And it's like, all right, as your pastor, I feel like we need to have some discussion about this. You know, like that's, I understand the desire, but like you're saying, being aware of nothing or intentionally avoiding and refusing to hear things that are hard to hear, you can fall off the other side of the road, you know? And so that's why we do advise 5 to 10 minutes of news and saying, hey, there's a risk of over consuming. There's also a risk of you missing things and being uninformed and not being able to engage with and love your neighbor or help your neighbor on the things that are causing them lots of anxiety or wrestling with hard issues that matter and that you should have an opinion and you can do something about. And part of what we're saying is getting to that point, to someone that hates the news and is avoiding the news, our message to them is it actually doesn't take, we're not telling you to drink from a fire hose. Like you can actually be engaged and be aware of pretty much everything that's going on in 5 to 10 minutes a day. Like you don't get very far if you spend that 5 to 10 minutes watching a cable news outlet. That's probably one story. But if you read something like The Pour Over, and there are a lot of other great resources, you can be aware of the things that are happening and then separate from the news, dive into issues and research and spend time in prayer and conversation with friends and pastors and stuff on issues that are actually relevant. But treating the news like you're reading the table of contents on a book that you know, man, 95 of these 100 chapters do not pertain to me. And so I'm not going to read all of them. I have a limited amount of time, but 5 of them do. And I need to figure out what those 5 are. And figuring out what those 5 are and wrestling and engaging and trying to love Christ excellently on those topics, it is, I would say, what we're called to do and what a biblical, a spiritually healthy relationship with the news looks like. It is, hey, if you're avoiding everything, no good. If you're only consuming and not doing anything, no good. What's this middle path of you're remaining informed to an end, to glorify God in your conversations, to glorify God in your actions and your causes. Like there are big things that come up that are relevant to you that we need Christians to be involved in and to act in. And so be informed and have conversations. And also, again, the most prevalent, the biggest way the news impacts me personally, and I would argue most people, is that other people are talking about the news. And you need, it is helpful to engage with them on the news and have those hard conversations and reflect the peace of Christ and the love of Christ, and this balance with this tension, and show people what that looks like, because that's what that study is saying, is people don't know how to handle conflict. They get angry and then they shut off. And it's like, no, Jesus hung out with a prostitute. That wasn't an endorsement of prostitution, but like he spent time with people that did things he disagreed with, believed things that he disagreed with. He loved them. He engaged with them. And there's an encouragement to stop doing that. And there's I hear with some regularity, no, like, this person's views are so evil, I don't even want to be associated with them. I can't even talk with them. I can't do whatever. We need to cut them off. And it's like, no, that's not what Jesus meant. We're called to love our enemies, not shut them out. It's not loving. It's not virtuous. It's not Christ-like to say, there's a hard thing happening, I'm going to avoid it. Or there's a hard thing happening and you disagree, you're done, you're hopeless. We need to engage. We need to love and be patient and listen to them and reflect Christ's love and value that relationship.
Yeah. It's a great way to summarize what we've been talking about. I know we only have a couple minutes left. I hate to bring up a whole brand new topic, but man, how do you help people understand where the news comes from? Like, in Israel, you'll hear, well, so many people died in Gaza last night, and here are the pictures. Well, wait, how do we know that actually? Where did that information come from? And why those pictures and not other pictures? Like, actually asking the question, how do we even know this? How do you help people with that?
Yeah. And I was asked recently, I was like, where do you get your news? And like, what's your trusted source? And it's like, the question behind the question is like, where can I go? Where can I easily go and get truth and only truth? I just want to know what's happening. And I think that the hard thing is to understand, like, it's not like that doesn't exist. There's not if you just go to Reuters, like they have all the information and present it perfectly. No, like these are imperfect news organizations, sometimes with overt motives, often with overt motives, working from incomplete information run by fallen humans, And so again, I think part of what the pour over does, and I think it is a valid criticism of the pour over, is the way we select stories is we just look for the most visible news of the day. So we're not trying to talk about the most spiritually impactful or significant news. We cover the most visible news. We have talked about who Taylor Swift is dating because everyone has talked about who Taylor Swift is dating. And our reminder is that, like, hey, it probably doesn't really matter who Taylor Swift is dating, but that's what people are talking about. And so, and so our goal is to say, this is what's being talked about. This is what people are saying. And the goal is, obviously, we want you, and we work very hard to understand what's actually going on and explain that. But we need to acknowledge, everyone consuming the news and writing the news needs to acknowledge that's not, like, even a video of the event can be skewed and wrong and not show the whole picture. So we need to go in with a certain amount of, like, cynicism is almost the wrong word, just understanding that this is inherently incomplete. And what the pour over is trying to do is to help you understand what people are hearing and talking about. It's not to say this happened and so this person's wrong. Maybe, possibly, and that certainly is true. We just can't definitively say that. And it's so natural to want that and to just be like, well, what actually happened? But it's like, that's why we have courts and like all the stuff. Like it's subjective. There are two versions. Sometimes there's just misunderstood facts and all this stuff. And that all applies to the news. But if you read the news with the goal of saying, I'm not going to understand everything, I'm not going to get definitive truth, but I am going to be aware of what's going on and know what other people are hearing so that I can love and engage with them. That is, I think, the best we can do. And it's kind of a disappointing answer, you know, and I'd love for it to not be the answer. Well, and maybe we'll get there.
I think that's a great answer, because we are in a fallen world and we don't get closure on everything that we'd like to have closure on. We're driven to it. We're constantly frustrated because we can't get it. If we just stop and ask, okay, how do I seek God's kingdom first? Trust that God will provide for me, and then engage with the people he puts in front of me. It gives a great balance, great counter perspective. Well, Jason, thanks for what you do for the Pour Over. It's easy to get to. Just
thepourover.org.
Okay.
You can also just Google the Pour Over News. It's a newsletter. It's also turned into a podcast. It's the same content either way.
Yeah. Well, you can sign up and see what you think and see if it's helpful for you. But Jason, this is just perfectly timely. So grateful for the conversation.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Thanks to my guest, Jason Woodruff, for coming on the show. Like the Pour Over, Summit is committed to providing accurate information from a biblical worldview. And that's really our mission, to equip and support rising generations to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. For those kinds of resources, check out summit.org/resources. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. The Dr. Jeff Show podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org/resources to find out about the programs, the articles, the videos, the ebooks, and more that we offer. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. Download it at edify.app, spell EDIFI. And then you can also search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store.